Expanding the concepts. So those that we covered in the last lesson are the core ideas for color maps of most architectural efforts. So go ahead and use these ideas to create color maps for the rest of the room. Now we're going to create materials and custom textures for the rest of the elements in this room. We'll leave the glass off the windows for now, and we'll get to that in a bit. So that is what we are doing today on the 18th in class, is we're creating textures for everything else. Now, as a reminder, because of just time constraints, the ambient occlusion pass is optional. I did assign it as homework for the 17th, but if you did not get to that homework because you were catching up, or if you're in a different class, that is a-okay. It's not gonna make or break anything. It's just an extra step for more polish. Not a big deal if you didn't get to it. So that's what this is going to talk about, ambient occlusion for texturing. So just to explain a little bit of what it is for our purposes, it's the concept of ambient lighting being occluded or left out of certain areas. AO has really only begun to really assert itself into the 3D artist consciousness, as the computing power to calculate it has just in the last few years, as of this book, become possible. The way I like to think of AO is visual dirt that collects in the corners. AO can be calculated at render time, but it will quickly add significantly to the time it takes to render a scene, which for animation's sake can add many hours to rendering time. In a game situation, while AO is available, it is often splotchy and takes a toll on real-time rendering times as well. Luckily, ambient occlusion can be baked into a texture. This is not literal baking, it means basically setting it to multiply and having it become part of the texture. Basically, the core concept is to have the rendering engine calculate what the AO would be, then export that to an image. And then we'll use that image and lay it down as a layer on our textures and get a real-time result that will give the scene dirt and dimension without adding additional rendering horsepower. So this process is no longer working. Mental Ray is no longer part of Maya. So please, please, please refer to that video from 2021. I labeled it as 2020, I think, because that was the version of Maya we were using. However, this now has to be done through Arnold. It's really simple. You just need a temporary file to do it in. So I'm going to go ahead and skip past all of this because it does not apply to us anymore. But here you can actually, this is with Mental Ray, but Arnold will show you something similar. This is what ambient occlusion does. So if we ignore textures, we ignore materials, this is what it does, is it calculates where light can reach and where it cannot based upon where objects are located in your room. This means if you decide later on, after doing all your textures, ambient occlusion, that you're going to move your table to the opposite side of the room, you're going to have to make a new temporary file, re-render out the ambient occlusion for the room and for that object, and then reapply those in the textures, get rid of the old ones, because it is specific to where these objects are in space. So baking the AO here basically just means bringing it into Photoshop. You just drag and drop it on top of whatever map you're working on in there, and you set it to multiply. It's very, very easy. It's not something we're going to concern ourselves too much with here. I believe I actually have the ambient occlusion for the window glass itself. Let me check here. I do. So I can actually show you what that would look like in Photoshop here shortly. But we're going to move on. Do note that on current PCs, you may not see a preview image here because it renders out to an EXR file. Totally fine if you don't. Photoshop can still read it. So here's just a before and after ambient occlusion, right? It just feels like it has more depth. So going beyond color. So far, we've built some pretty sophisticated color maps to define the surfaces of the shapes in our rooms. But materials in Maya can be more than just color, so very much more. As you probably guessed from the multitude of options available in the attribute editor, whenever dealing with a material, there are lots of other attributes that can be defined. Covering them is outside of the scope of this book, but in the coming steps, we will be looking at two of them that are particularly useful: transparency and bump mapping. We'll actually be using normal maps, but it's basically the same purpose as bump maps. Transparency. Transparency maps can do some very sophisticated things. When any material is selected and opened in the attribute editor, the entire material can be made transparent by simply sliding the transparency slider to the right. However, this has limited efficacy in our situations, as the windows in that dirty of a room should have collected some grime on the window panes as well. They're old, which should mean that these panes of glass are neither clean nor totally transparent. With a transparency texture map, we can define what parts of the window panes are transparent and which are completely opaque, and what is somewhere in between. Now, there are several ways to approach transparency maps. Maya works pretty well with Photoshop documents that can read alpha channels and other attributes of a PSD file, so that one file can define lots of attributes of a material. However, for illustration's sake on how materials are put together, in this tutorial, we're going to create a separate color and transparency maps and tie them in discrete chains of nodes. But first, we need to create a quick color texture for the window panes. For this, we'll be using a slightly different method than we have in the past. Namely, we'll be using the AO pass as the foundation for our texture. The reason for this has to do with the topology of the window glass pane. When I modeled the panes, they were built with single polygon planes and put into a window shape. The benefit is that it was a quick solution to have an object for glass. The drawback is that it would be very tough to try and pick out where each of the transoms and mullions, the wood between the panes, go, and where dirt and other collected grime would go. Luckily, this AO pass of the panes shows exactly where the individual panes should be. This provides us a great template upon which to build our color map. A basic idea to remember about these separate transparency maps is that Maya will interpret black pixels as transparent and white pixels as opaque. Gray pixels will render as semi-transparent. This is important, and you might want to take a moment here to highlight this in the book or your own notes. Okay. With this paradigm in mind, we can create a custom map that defines exactly what's opaque and what's transparent. So I'm going to preview real quick here. Yes, that's correct. Okay. So if you don't have an ambient occlusion map of this is totally fine. So let me show you the two methods for doing this. If you do have an ambient occlusion map, oops, I think I have that already open here. All you have to do is just bring it in and open it as transparency. Not great, we can't really see where the UVs are, but we could always bring in our UV map as well. So let me do that. Let's see, no glass UVs. And just like before, we can go into blending options. Stroke. Okay, now we know exactly where the windows are, and this is going to help a heck of a whole lot. So you can do it this way and use the AO map to give you the transparency you need. Alternatively, let's say you don't have an AO map for this. You just didn't have the time for it, or your computer is not powerful enough. All you have to do is open the window glass, blending options. Let's say stroke. Okay. And what I'm going to do is rename this to UV snapshot. I'm going to make a new layer above. Okay. Or below, I reckon. And what we're going to do is we're going to come up to the UV snapshot layer, and with the magic wand tool, shift click the insides of all of these. Careful not to select the outside. I'm then going to go to select, modify, expand, and I'm going to expand by 6 pixels just to be safe, because sometimes there's going to leave a little, it'll leave a little ring of pixels around the edge of the UV on the inside, which we don't want. So by going to select, modify, expand, we can make sure that the selection is actually bigger than our UVs. This is good because remember, Maya doesn't read anything outside of the UVs. I'm going to come back to layer 1. I'm going to pick a really obnoxious color to fill these with. Okay. Now, the reason I'm picking an obnoxious color is just so I can see which ones I have worked on and which ones I have not. Okay. So now what I can do is I can marquee select over one of, let me actually come over and right click here. No, click on layer 1 and click this button right here that looks like a checkerboard under lock. This is lock pixels. And what this does is let me get a different brush here. There we go. Is it keeps you from being able to draw or paint outside of them, which is really handy. Because now I can come here and select just one square. I'm going to click and hold on my paint bucket to get the gradient tool. And from the drop down here, let's see, basics, I'm going to pick the black and white option. And I'm going to make sure here before I do that, actually, I'm going to select this second option here, which is radial. And I'm going to click and drag from the middle outward quite a bit. Okay, it's making it black in the middle, so I'm going to say reverse. Click and drag from the middle. And what I want to do is I want to get it gray, but not black on the outside. Okay, so this is what we can do as a means of working around not having ambient occlusion for the windows. So again, marquee select the next one. You can press G on your keyboard to return to that gradient tool. Click and drag out. Command or Control D to deselect. And for marquee tool, we'll need to do this window by window. It will take a little bit of time, but it is necessary for this. Now, the trade-off is that this is not specific with how your window frames may be casting stuff over them, but in practice, I haven't seen it make too big of a difference. And sometimes you can get some nicer results. It just really depends on the person, on the topology. These do not have to be perfectly the same either, which is really cool. Okay, so I'm going to take a moment and get the rest of these squared away. All right, so I've made my fake ambient occlusion. If I want to be fancy, I can name it. Let's see. Faux, spelled incorrectly because it's fake AO. Oh, it's backwards. All right. Again, this works just as well. If you have the ambient occlusion map, you don't need to do this. This is if you don't have one. Okay, the process from here for either one will be exactly the same. So we're going to grab some grimy materials and we're going to lay that grime that would be on the individual window panes. You can do this in Photoshop and keep these grime layers unflattened. Okay, so really important about there, don't flatten them yet. Okay. So the way I like to do this, and again, this is the process is the same either way we're doing it now, is I'm going to reuse some of this drippy, gross material that we had from the walls. My apologies for this one here. Don't keep that one. Keep the PNG. Okay. I'm going to, again, make sure it's slightly outside here. And if you want, since we're going to create a texture and a transparency map all in one, you can keep these colors the same if you want. You can make them different. You can hold shift to make some of these longer. Again, you can go to edit, transform, flip horizontal. You can layer up a couple of them on one if you want. Just to get them looking a little bit different from one another. Oops. And shift to skew. Again, you can have it also come outside because it can't read anything outside. so on and so forth. And I'm going to just work my way up the tops and downs of these. I'm going to make each one a little bit different just so it doesn't look copy pasted. And I'm going to do them along the tops and the bottoms at the minimum. If you want to do them from the sides too, you can. You can just hold shift to rotate that at a 90-degree angle and put them in that way. You can even make them just like super short so they don't come in super far, however you want to go about it. But at the minimum, do the tops and the bottoms of each of these window panes. All right, I'll return to the recording once I have this done. All right, so at this time, I have successfully grimed up these windows top and bottom. They are looking wonderfully grungy. And again, I did not merge any of these layers, so it is full, but that is a-okay. One thing I will do here is do a little bit of renaming. So for me, this is the AO pass, the actual one. And this is the UV snapshot. I'm gonna go stick this at the top. There are many, many layers here. Some of them I skewed really wide, some of them I skewed short and really narrow. I did a lot of transform horizontal to get these to look less copy pasted. Okay. So what we're gonna do is, let's see here. Okay, so he has us just save this out as a JPEG. So first, let me turn off my UV snapshot here. I'm gonna save this as a Photoshop file in my images folder. And I'm gonna update it with the date. So go ahead and input your own date. This will be ETM, window glass, texture, and then a version number. Okay, once that's saved, I'm going to save as, and I'm going to come up to the source images folder, change this to JPEG. See, I cannot actually change it to JPEG right now. Now, the reason for that is because this file size is too big. It's got too many layers. So if that doesn't work for you, you can go to File, Export, Save for Web Legacy. Let's see here. Export as. Yeah, okay. So we can go to Export As and I can select JPEG. Make sure it's at 100% scale. Okay, and then I can press Export. I'm going to have to go find. Escaping the Madness. Source images. I'm going to save it right in here. Export. Okay, so if that doesn't work, let you save as a JPEG, naturally you can go to File, Export, Export As, or Save for Web Legacy. Right, that's important because that is our texture file. I'm not going to apply it right away in Maya, just so I can work in just exclusively one at a time. And then we'll backtrack and do that. Well, but right now it looks pretty creepy. And there's no transparency. So we really need to have some of that window be at least a little bit transparent. So we need to create a custom transparency map. So we're going to do this via adjustment layers. So adjustment layers adjust everything below in the layers panel. So we're going to create an inverse black and white version of the color map. To do this in Photoshop, we need to go make a new adjustment layer that says black and white. To do this, we're going to come to the very top layer and click on it, make sure it's selected. Then at the bottom of the layers panel, there will be this half moon symbol. I'm going to click on the half moon symbol. Let's see, it's not giving me the option for black and white. So what I'm going to do here So I'm going to throw all of this in a folder here to make this easier. Okay. And I'm going to shift select and I'm going to rasterize all of these. So I think that might be what's happening here. Let me make it above the group. Interesting. So it's not giving me the option for black and white, and I'm not quite sure why. But I can do hue saturation, and I can just bring the saturation all the way down to -100, and this will effectively turn it black and white. So if you're not able to get the black and white working, again, I'm not sure why, maybe it's just a file size thing. You can do hue saturation and just bring saturation all the way to the left until it says -100. Okay. Then we're going to make an invert adjustment layer on top of that. So I'm going to click here. We're going to see, okay. It's not going to let me invert, which is interesting. We said not to merge these, but I'm just curious if that will change things. Interesting. Let me see if I can figure out why that's happening so I can explain a better solution in the meantime. Hang tight. I figured it out. Okay, so in all of Adobe's wisdom, there's a running theme with this if you haven't caught on. It forces certain changes to the Photoshop interface when it updates. So I'm going to undo some of this here. So the way we get these normal adjustment layers to work is you have to change your mode to 16 bits instead of 32. So I'm going to go to Image, Mode. See, I can't even make adjustments. That's so silly. Mode, and I'm going to say 16 bits per channel. And I'm going to say don't merge. Give this a moment to do its thing. Okay, it's done thinking. Now if I click above group 1, I now have the option to do black and white. All right, and on top of that, I can do invert. All right. Okay. Again, we're going to make sure this is on top of the layers. The results will have a creepy but effective use here. So we're then going to save this as a JPEG to the source images folder. So first I'll save as a new version in Photoshop because we did some steps. Okay, and then I'm going to save as a JPEG. This is letting me do it the normal way now, so I guess that 32 bits thing had something to do with the file size. I'm going to come into source images and I'm going to change the name here from texture to transparency. And then press save and OK. So something to note here is adjustment layers are non-destructive methods to getting broad adjustments to your Photoshop file. For this is a perfect use of them as it keeps our color versions within the raw version of the texture. That way, if we decide to change anything, we still have that color information and can simply turn off the adjustment layers when it's time to save out the JPEG color texture for Maya and then reactivate them for a new transparency texture. All right, so now I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to close out of Photoshop and open Maya. All right, as always, when you open Maya for the first time, since you last closed it, set your project, open your scene, so I recently saved this with an updated file name, but if you have not yet, make sure to update the date and the version number. The next thing we're going to do is we need to create a material for these panes of window. As you can see here, I've not applied some of these other textures yet. I will do that soon. So I'm going to open the Hypershade to start by pressing here, or I can go into Windows, Rendering Editors, Hypershade. Now for this one, we don't want to use a Lambert. The reason for that is Lamberts aren't shiny, they're matte, M-A-T-T-E. So for this, I'm going to come here to Surface under Maya. I think for this one, I am going to pick, which one do I want? Fong is really super shiny, super specular. So I think we can get some really good reflections with it. So I'm going to go with Fong, P-H-O-N-G. Okay. This will open the property editor. Over here, I'm going to rename this to Glass Window Matte. So I want to put glass first because there will be multiple window names. Just so I can tell very quickly what it is when it's up here and it's hard to see the name. If you want to keep all your windows together, you can do window glass matte. Okay. Then I'm going to come to the checkerboard next to color. I'm going to select File. If you don't see File, click on 2D Textures. Okay. I'm going to click on the folder next to File Name. And I am going to find the glass texture, not transparency, just the texture. Open. Now I'll select the windows. Again, there's 3 different ways you can do this. We can right click and hold on the window, assign existing material. We can middle mouse drag glass window onto here, but sometimes it accidentally goes on the wrong thing. Or we can right click and hold assign material to selection. So I'm going to do that one just so we can kind of see this before and after here. Okay. So go ahead and take a moment to make sure you have that all situated. And then we're going to implement the new transparency map. And we have to do this in the Hypershade, in that matte, in this material. So if you don't see this attribute editor, you can just click on glass window again. It will reset the property editor here. We're going to click the checker button at the end of the transparency line and choose File from the Create Render node. And then we're going to select the transparency JPEG. So I'm going to click right here, File, Folder, and I'm going to select Window Glass Transparency. Ooh, look at that. You can kind of see through it now. Ho-ho. It seems like we should be set. In fact, if you take a look at the material in the Hypershade, it should look something like this. And it indicates that there is indeed transparency on the material. But yet in the view panel, everything looks the same. Maya's trying to draw the scene quickly to make the process. We can tell Maya to draw more than that. I don't think that's an issue anymore. Yeah, that's not something we have to worry about. It should be see-through now. As we can see the void out through it. It's not white anymore, so that's a pretty good indication. So I don't think we need to worry about any of that. So there we go. Now at this time, what we can do, let me minimize the Hypershade, is let's just do a transparency test. Okay, I don't want to move any furniture in here because that AO mapping that I did is really specific to where these are, and it's going to shade things black right under the feet, so I don't want to move them. So instead, I'm just going to go to Create, Polygon Primitive, Sphere, just like we saw in the example, and just temporarily I'm going to move this outside of the window, come inside the room, and make sure it is visible enough. It's over here. Yeah, okay, that works. This isn't so, I was concerned because mine was really gray in the middle. It wasn't black, but I think we have just ample view here. And you can see as I rotate around, the window is in fact shining. Aha, like glass. All right. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Okay. I'm going to go to Edit, delete all by type history, just to clean up my file a little bit more. Okay. If you have any weird folders like this, go ahead and just make sure things are renamed appropriately. This is window interior frame. This out of that group, delete the excess group. Okay, so go ahead and take a moment to clean up your outliner is needed. This one is ETM room window glass. Okay, and then save your file as a new version once your outliner is cleaned up. Well done. So next step here would be to apply textures to everything else. I will go ahead and share my screen once those textures are on, so you can see things start to come together. And then that will conclude lesson 2.4 part 2.